Good afternoon, everyone, and it is afternoon. My name is Sal Mangiafico, and I work with Rutgers Cooperative Extension in this part of the state in Salem and Cumberland counties. I'm going to be the moderator for the panel discussion this afternoon. We do have one rule for this panel discussion. That is, there is no after brunch napping in the audience. As Flavia noted, the bios for everyone are in the program with some pretty pictures. So you can feel free to read those at your leisure. I'm not going to say much as I introduce each of our panelists, just basically one sentence to let you know who they are. The idea is that we'll go through our 6 panelists and they can get up and give 5 or 6 minutes of a presentation. They can either speak from the table, or if you want to get up, that's fine. We're planning on 5 or 6 minutes per speaker to move this along and get time for questions. All right. All right. Okay, so first up is Dan Saunders, who works for the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office as the Administrator and Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer, as well as being involved in many local preservation and restoration projects in New Jersey and in neighboring states.
Get up and get over here because this is where the controller is for the PowerPoint.
Okay.
You can take it back with you if you walk around.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that. So I thought I would start big and work down to New Jersey. Can you hear me? Should I try that? Is that better? So this is a map put together by the Army Corps of Engineers that shows basically the New York Harbor area 8,000 years ago. One of the themes Lester talks about is water, so I thought I'd talk a little bit about water and cultural resources. If you look for Native American archaeological sites, you want to know where they are, there's one really pretty simple rule. You're going to be looking within about 200 feet of fresh water or water supplies, because that's what you need every day, and it's very hard to carry, heavy, not easy to carry. So this is New Jersey's coast, and you can see, let me get this to work here. You know, there's Sandy Hook right there, that ridge. This whole thing right here is the Raritan Bay. You think of the island of Manhattan, that's up there. So this is what happens to the shoreline in 8,000 years. It's a huge amount of change. And we all talk about climate change, and do you believe in climate change or global warming or whatever? What's undisputable is that the water level has risen incredibly dramatically over the last 8,000 years, and it was much lower than that at the beginning of the last warming age. Another thing about water that relates again to the sort of the archaeological and the anthropological perspective is that we love water. We love to be near water. You know, we build towns and communities very close to the water. We love that view. And one of the reasons for that is that we've lived near water for the last 1.5 million years, the whole history of our species. It's comforting to be near water because water is an essential thing for you to have. So it's entirely natural that we want to live near the water, and of course that has its challenges when you have global warming. There's an island off the east coast of England, just a little bit north of London. It's an island you can walk to. No, I'm pushing the wrong button, sorry. This is the path to the island. So you walk out this ramp that comes off the shore, and you walk between the broomsticks. It's called the Broomway, this path. And you walk out about 300 yards directly out into the English Channel, and then you make a left turn and you walk about 2 miles, and you get to the island. So here's somebody walking to the island. So the question I have for you is, how did anybody know this pathway was there? Think about that first slide in the global warming change. The answer is really pretty simple. The answer is that this has been a walking path for thousands of years. It's just that the water level used to be much, much lower. And so now today with the rise in sea level, you can only reach that point by walking at low tide and knowing which way to go by following the broomsticks. So it's an adapted trail that man has adapted to the change, the slow change, but change over time to this path. Another quick slide is just Fort Hancock. Those of you know, I showed you Sandy Hook in the middle of the picture on that first slide. Well, this is Fort Hancock, which is part of Sandy Hook. And I'm transitioning here to how do we start to think to deal with historic buildings and historic places at the national level. So this is managed by the National Park Service. And I think you all know the National Park Service has in its the Organic Act that created it a statement to the effect of to preserve our valuable resources for future generations, which is kind of another way of describing sustainability in some sense. So this is something the National Park Service has identified that they're supposed to preserve. This is actually a National Historic Landmark. So this is the highest level of designation in the United States of America for a historic property. So they have this incredibly high level of obligation to maintain it. And the National Park Service, as a federal agency, takes their mission very seriously. They're very cautious about change. They try to study things. They try to really do it right. So what do you do in a situation like that? Sorry. This is probably a boring slide, but it's actually a very important slide. This is a spreadsheet. It's a table. It comes out of the general management plan for Sandy Hook that the Park Service does a big public planning effort. So we have a national park with a mission to preserve everything that they have that's important. We have something at the highest level of designation of historic significance. And what I want you to just take a look at is that this list of buildings here are all the buildings, this is a part of the list of all the buildings that are at Sandy Hook. And what they've done here is they've given each building in this column here, they give it a treatment option. And over a couple over, they have a description of the building and kind of where it's at physically and what's going on. And what I want you to look at is, for instance, the post-theater transformer building. And they have this category called ruin. What the heck is that? Brand new. Park Service has been thinking very hard about climate change. Sandy Hook was badly impacted by Hurricane Sandy. About a 10-foot wave of water swept across the island, moved sand, damaged buildings. And so they're balancing and they're figuring out what to do. They're still in the process of figuring it out. But this table shows you that they've developed this category of ruin, which is a building or a resource that they are no longer going to invest in. In other words, they're not going to put any dollars into it. And some of these buildings which are in ruin status are actually occupied or are vacant with a high potential for reuse. But they're not going to invest dollars in them because the odds are in a relatively short period of time these buildings will be so affected by climate change that they're not usable. So what you see here is the adaptation of the federal policy to find a way to deal with the fact that we're going to have to make choices with climate change. There are some historic resources that we're going to be able to protect. We should invest money and time into them. And there's others where we're just going to leave them there in the state now. We're not going to walk away from them exactly, but we're not going to invest more money in them. It's a hard choice. It's a hard decision, but this is the federal government in action trying to figure that out. The last thing I want to talk about is just what the value of cultural resources is in terms of thinking about sustainability. We think a lot in the state office and nationally about how you make buildings more energy efficient that are historic. And that's important. And we talk about the embodied energy in the building, which is the idea that all the resources that have gone into constructing the building, the carbon that's physically embodied in the building, are resources that shouldn't be just wasted. You can easily get into a kind of a fallacious argument there, but there's a value to that thought. But I guess what I want to suggest is that there's another way that these historic buildings are important to us. And that is that they're not embodied energy, but they're embodied wisdom. If you're in a town that was built in 1850, Bridgeton is an old town, you're looking at a town that existed and survived quite well at a time when the carbon footprint of any individual person was very, very small. There were no machines, there were no lights, and yet the buildings could function. So these buildings and the towns as a whole have a kind of embodied wisdom about how to live at a lower energy use. And of course, if we remember that the population was probably much higher then than it is today, you could even fit more people into the same size city and get the same values. So, the form of the buildings and the form of the street layout reflect the climate. They reflect what was locally available as material, because you couldn't move things very far. They reflect the available technology, of course. And they're a solution to this question of how should you live in a certain kind of a place that we can draw from. So there's embodied wisdom there. And I'm going to leave it there so the next person can get up and talk. Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks, Dan. Next up, we have Michael Henry, who is a founding partner of Watson & Associates, which specializes in the preservation of historic buildings. He has consulted throughout the United States and internationally as well on sustainable environmental management at museums and historic buildings.
Thank you. I don't have a presentation for you, but I'd like to reflect on some notes that I took this morning and use these as a starting point for questions and answers as we engage the audience in our panel discussion this afternoon. Lester Brown has presented us with thought-provoking information and forward thinking on a macro and global scale. As I see it, our challenge today as a group, all of us, is to transform this into action at a local level, either as communities, groups of people, or even as individuals. The central theme of this gathering, bringing sustainability home, is key to that action. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term sustainability and its full definition, it's defined as balancing strengths and assets in equal parts across three areas: the environment, the economy, and society itself. Mark Gould touched on this. He described that we have to achieve this with a strong sense of stewardship. Stewardship not only in terms of our earth resources, but also in terms of our humanity and our respect for our fellow citizens and residents and inhabitants. Flavia asked us to be futurists today, but to visualize a future and its possibilities, we have to understand the trajectory of the past and the large-scale external forces that will bend that trajectory going forward. Understanding these forces and how they interact requires what Michael Edelstein referred to as systems awareness, and which the environmental thinker Donella Meadows so beautifully explained in her book, Systems Thinking, which I think is the perfect complement to Lester Brown's books and should actually be required reading. So as we think about change at the county level, particularly Western Cumberland County, I would like us to consider a couple of things. One is, Shirley Klein mentioned our status statewide with respect to agriculture and our primacy as agricultural producers. But if we look back historically, we might ask ourselves how much of that in the past was really food production as opposed to production of other items such as sod or nursery stock, which really isn't classified as food. Also, historically, we have to consider the role that the bay played in our economy and environment, that being the fisheries, both shell fishing and fin fishing, which we once had primacy even in terms of oyster production and caviar production. But those are no longer part of our economy because of what we've done to the environment. Dan mentioned sea level rise, and we need to consider this as bayside communities. Sea level rise not only in terms of its dramatic impact on our villages, which are proximate to the water, but also in the loss of arable farmland as meadows and tidal flats encroach on land that has been used for production historically, but will no longer be available either because of saline contamination or other threats that come from sea level rise. And then lastly, I'd ask us to think about the social component. Again, looking back historically, The rural townships in western Cumberland County were interdependent with Bridgeton. Bridgeton was the governmental, educational, social, and cultural center for western Cumberland County. We all relied on it, and yet as Bridgeton has declined, and I'll say that, as it's declined economically, we've lost a tremendous opportunity. And we need to think about how collectively we can reinstate that. That brings me also to the question of social change. We've talked about environmental and economic change, but there's social change afoot, and part of that strengthening the social sustainability of Bridgeton requires that we think positively about how we can integrate and engage the new census that's taking place within Bridgeton and within Cumberland County at large, and making that population a part of what we want to do going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Michael. Our next speaker on the panel is Matt Blake. He is the Director of Community Development for Woolwich Township. This involves the balancing intelligently of preservation, park expansion, development, and tourism for that town.
Thank you. For several years just prior to the recession, Woolwich Township made national headlines as the fastest growing community in the Northeast, if not the entire Eastern Seaboard. During this time, we went from having some of the lowest taxes in Gloucester County to some of the highest in South Jersey. We were building a new school every year. This for a town that was once the tomato capital of New Jersey and boasted probably the largest amount of primary soils dedicated to agriculture of any town in the state. In 1990, the township barely had 1,400 residents, yet by 2010, our population was 10,200. The township's population was expected to increase, with full residential build-out forecasted in 2029 at nearly 32,000 residents. Clearly, something had to change, or the town would quickly bankrupt itself. In order to not become the poster child for sprawl development in New Jersey, with all its significant impacts on resources, agriculture, and fiscal health to community, the town adopted a comprehensive transfer development program in 2008, a bold growth management tool to shift development to where it made sense while harnessing the private market to preserve over 5,000 acres of farmland. For us, the recession actually saved the town and presented several opportunities we were able to take advantage of. With a reprieve from development pressure, the township was able to take stock in all that had changed since the recession and gained breathing room to reassess its planning goals and make adjustments. This gave us the opportunity to focus on emerging trends in the housing market, which studies now show favor denser, more center-based development. The second most important opportunity provided by the recession was the ability to advance unprecedented land preservation. Before the township adopted tight land use controls in TDR, developers had locked in development approvals for hundreds of houses in the town's 5,000-acre farm belt. Had they been built, the effectiveness of our efforts and the TDR program would have been muted once these areas became peppered with subdivisions. However, when the recession hit, our developers suddenly became all too willing to preserve, and at significant cost savings to our taxpayers. With a 5-cent open space tax in hand, county and state support, the township went aggressively after each one, and between 2008 and 2014, the township saw the preservation of over 1,500 acres of open space and farmland. Was it a good investment? Some may say maybe these houses would never be built in the post-recession climate. Well, it turns out with the 2013 census figures now available for the 9-county Philly metro area, on the New Jersey side, Woolwich Township over the past 3 years saw some of the most tremendous growth at 10.14% and growing. And despite our best efforts to limit growth, the township is still forecasted to see the highest percentage of growth of all the nine county Metro Philly areas by 2040. The good news is that with the town's TDR program, over 5,000 acres of land will be preserved as a result of this coming development. While it seems unlikely Cumberland County will see that kind of development pressure anytime soon, that doesn't diminish the need to preserve. While the recession has slowed growth, it didn't stop it. And unless we can find ways to encourage greater development and interest in our downtowns, we'll continue to see the slow but steady, low-density development in the areas we're trying to preserve. That brings us to ballot question 2. That's why passage of ballot question 2 on November 4th is so important to preserving our open space, farmland, and to historic preservation, which reallocates a portion of the existing business tax without raising taxes. You can't call something sustainable if it's not a good investment. In New Jersey, for every dollar invested by Green Acres, we see a $10 return in economic value through flood control, the filtering of air and water, and other pollutants. For example, the #1 forest product isn't the lumber. It's clean air, it's clean water, which protects our agriculture, protects our fisheries, and helps address climate change in terms of making sure that we have abundant groundwater to hold pressure against an advancing salt line and to reduce our climate impact. Hundreds of jobs annually result from Green Acres Park development, producing over 7,000 jobs, contributing over $1.7 billion to our overall economy. According to a recent study by the Nature Conservancy, the annual amount spent by birders in southern Cape May on an annual basis is now at $313 million and growing. Establishing a robust ecotourism industry in Cumberland is not going to happen by accident. Although we've done a good job of protecting natural areas here, the job isn't finished, and we need to focus on developing resources so they can pay us back by bringing greater tourism here. One of the reasons ecotourism is so big in Cape May County is marketing, the hospitality industry, public access to park infrastructure, particularly trails. Doing things like increasing marketing, education, and support of startup businesses, whether it be in hospitality or in heritage tourism on our farmland, could pay huge dividends in time. The county ecotourism plan is from 1994 and ought to be updated as part of an overall ecotourism plan, looking at heritage tourism, ecotourism, and the overall tourism industry. For example, if wild and scenic river status has been good for the Morris River and its towns, that ought to be something we think about doing here in terms of increasing the exposing areas and visitors to places like Bridgeton, Ferreton, and Greenwich Township. Agriculture. We need to do more to keep farming economically viable in the state and region. Cumberland County is an agricultural powerhouse, first among all New Jersey counties in value of agricultural products sold. It's a $157 million industry, contributing roughly $2 billion to the county economy. With our ideal soils, moderate climate, abundant freshwater resources, know-how, and access to huge markets, we're one of the best suited areas in the country for sustainable agriculture. And when you start thinking about the droughts, the overuse of fossil water out west, and rising transportation costs, that only reiterates the need to preserve the working land base so we can preserve food security at a national level in the region in South Jersey. Ownership transitions. One of the biggest challenges will be the transition of properties and businesses to new farmers. According to a 2007 study in the 100-mile Philadelphia food shed, the average age of our farmers is over 55. As farmers age and retire, a new generation is needed to take over management and businesses of our working landscapes. An increasing number of beginning farmers today come from non-farm backgrounds. These aren't folks who will have the land passed down to them, and to be successful will require access to affordable land because agriculture has slim profit margins subject to extreme fluctuations in the global market. Moreover, the considerable upfront capital land investment costs required to earn a very small profit is often a barrier to many small and beginning farmers. That's why preservation is so important, even in areas where growth pressure is not as great. to keep the costs down. And although we're seeing increasing market opportunities for our farmers, which is an important vital sign, small and beginning farmers face significant obstacles in accessing the knowledge, land, and capital necessary to start and expand their operations. The traditional farm financing through commercial lenders and government agencies is not geared for smaller beginning farmers. So having a loan program established to meet their needs that's tied to technical assistance could be very important. There are good examples in other places like the Adirondacks, Pennsylvania, and Vermont, where creative partnerships are bridging these gaps, creating new jobs and businesses as a result, where counties, nonprofits, and institutions are working together on providing direct financial assistance, grants, or lease-to-own programs, as well as coordination with financial providers, borrowers, lenders, providing technical assistance, and education to build capacity and lending benchmarks to facilitate the flow of capital and knowledge. Luckily, we have the right mix of players with the County Agricultural Development Board, our nonprofits, the county college, and thankfully, the Technical Education Center coming. Together, these entities can meet these challenges if we decide it is important to do so. The county has done a truly remarkable job given its limited resources. We've preserved over 17,500 acres on 155 farms. But the job is not finished. That is out of over 69,500 acres waiting to be preserved. And there are other areas that need attention to help create jobs and sustainable economic growth, such as dealing with ownership transitions, support of farm business enterprise, which includes the growth of the agritourism industry, and fostering healthy ecotourism alongside. I believe we have the right partners and many of the right resources. Let's create a framework for working together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Our fourth speaker on the panel is Daphne Monroe. She works for Rutgers University at the Institute of Marine and Coastal Sciences and studies shellfish ecology. She's an assistant professor and also does research on sustainable fisheries and aquaculture.
Thank you. Good, my mic came on. Thank you all for joining us this morning, spending a Saturday on such an important conversation. And more importantly, thank you to Lester for being the nexus on this conversation about sustainability that's so, so important for all of us. As the introduction said there, I'm a Rutgers professor. I study shellfish ecology. My laboratory focuses largely on issues around aquaculture and fisheries, and these are food production systems. This is a lot of what we've been talking about today. My research is motivated by predictability. How do we predict changes in natural ecosystems? And if we can get to predictability, we can get to stability in economics that rely on these ecosystems and on the goods that come from them. And from that stability, we can eventually get to a sustainable place. And so my inspiration in predictability is not all that different than the transformative work that Lester's done in his career, right? He's able to foresee impacts around the globe that maybe aren't so obvious to other people, and in that predictability has affected sustainability. Forgive me. So I'll talk first a little bit about fisheries in New Jersey, and for those of you who aren't as familiar with the New Jersey fisheries, these are major, major fisheries. The commercial fisheries in New Jersey are largely composed of shellfish fisheries. These are scallops, oysters, clams, and of the commercial fisheries, shellfish alone accounts for 80% of the money that comes into New Jersey at the dock. This is massive. And they're not only big industries here in New Jersey, they're big on a national level and they're big on a global level. These are big fisheries that are here. The oyster fishery in the Bay is one of those. And it's one of those that has cultural roots here in Bridgeton and in other communities along the Bay Shore. I'll shift now to talk about aquaculture because I believe that that's also an important place that we can look to maybe take a glance through this glass ceiling that Lester was talking about in food production systems. Fisheries are inherently unstable. We have difficulty with predictability. Farms, on the other hand, are much more predictable. So if we can put these farms in the marine system, we get not only increased efficiency, you can grow much more shellfish on a small footprint farm than you can in the entire fishery in New Jersey. But it also, so I want to talk a little bit first about the definition of aquaculture, just so that it's one of these things that people sometimes aren't all that familiar with. It looks like, in their minds, this massive Norwegian salmon farm off the coast somewhere. We have these farms here in New Jersey. We have clam farms, we have oyster farms. It's a small industry today, but it's growing, and there's lots of room for growth. A farm in the terrestrial sense and in the marine sense means ownership of the animals that are on that farm and husbandry. So these aquaculturists, just like traditional farmers on land, own the product that is on their farm, and they tend it. So these things add stability to the system and add predictability. Another piece that I want to talk about, and I'm really glad to have Tribal Elder Mark Gould here with us today, and John Norwood. Thank you both for welcoming us into your community. Is this idea of farms, and we feel it, I think, in the terrestrial sense, but farms having a cultural legacy and a cultural integration. They're a way to have community, and community interacts through a farm. People don't typically think much about aquaculture in that sense. And people tend to think that aquaculture is a new industry. This is something that maybe we don't know enough about, these kinds of things. And granted, it is growing globally, but it's not new. And I'll tell you a story quickly about some work that I did this past summer on the Pacific coast. So it's not a New Jersey story, but I think it has important implications for how we think about aquaculture and aquaculture development here in New Jersey. I was working on some traditional clam gardens on the Pacific coast, and what these are is they're pocket areas of intertidal where family groups, tribal family groups, owned this piece of intertidal, and they would make adjustments to the intertidal. They put terraces in to increase clam productivity, and they would go out and they would increase the amount of clams that were there. They tended these farms. They would maintain those terraces. And I'm talking not over a couple of years, thousands of years. These were inherited and passed down through family lines as a way of food security. In years when the wild salmon returns were low, they always had that investment, that shellfish garden out in front of their villages that they could rely on as food stability. But more than that, these places, because of the type of work that would go on a shellfish farm, and still does, it's not highly technical, it's not highly labor intensive, so it was largely done by the elders and by the children. And in those exercises, the family stories were passed along, and the communities were being cultivated along with those clams. So I wanted to bring that story to the table, because I think we're not just talking about food supplies here, we're also talking about building communities in a sustainable and stable way. I also wanted to touch on this idea that Lester brought up earlier, and this was about water productivity, and I think this is a really critical issue, and in that sense he was not necessarily talking about marine water, but fresh water that supplies our farms. And there's another type of modified aquaculture, if you will, that possibly also allows us to look through that glass ceiling in terms of water productivity, and that's aquaponics. That's growing fish in a closed recirculating system with vegetables. And if we do that, those farmers are aware of every single drop of water that goes through their system. And that water gets recycled, and there's ecological processes that help the water be recycled. There's bacteria in the system that help denitrify. There's fish being fed, and those wastes then feed the nutrients that the plants need. And if those systems are set up in balance, those can be a way of increasing water productivity and really valuing the water that comes through a farm. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you all for your attention.
Thanks, Daphne. Our fifth and penultimate speaker is Megan Wren. Megan launched the Bayshore Center at Bivalve, which provides education, school programming, and special events, and also houses the restored oyster schooner, the A.J. Meerwald. Now is also involved with working on the sustainability of the Delaware Bayshore in response to Superstorm Sandy.
Thanks, Sal. Glad to be part of this. It's a thrill to be on the stage with Lester Brown, with everything that he represents to the environmental community. And thanks, Flavia, for pulling this together. I think the idea of bringing things from global to local is something that I've contemplated and our organization has tried to do from the beginning. And you might say, what does a boat have to do with food policy? And I hope that that's something that gradually people will get. And I'm just going to flip through quickly through the kind of how we got to where we are with starting with a boat. And actually, from the very beginning, our intent was to start about the whole Bayshore and the whole region. And looking at it from a satellite, you can see how important the Delaware Bay is in shaping South Jersey. It really defines who we are and what our history was and what our current lifestyle is. Our mission at the Bayshore Center is to motivate people to take care of their place, basically, the history, the culture, the environment of New Jersey's Bayshore region through education, preservation, and example. So the idea here is to just flip quickly, so I need to figure this out. The history, this visual to me says it all. And the culture, in my mind, includes the maritime culture that's so important to this region, as well as the artistic culture. There's so many things in this area that define who we are. And the environment, of course, is a hugely important element of the region. We started with the Meerwald. That's what she looked like when we got started. And after 8 years of restoration, building community, not just building a boat. I think that's what we've always been about, trying to involve people, trying to get people. And I like what Daphne said about the elders and the children working together on the West Coast. We have a lot of intergenerational activities at the organization and use the Meerwald as a platform to get kids out in the water. Oftentimes, even though they're from a waterfront community, they've never been on a boat before, much less contemplated the history and the current ecology of the area. We have very hands-on programming, and we take the Meerwald in many places as New Jersey's official tall ship. She travels all around New Jersey, taking the word of Cumberland County and South Jersey and the Delaware Bay to people all over the state. One of our favorite concepts is the schooner as a microcosm for the planet. And you think about your resources being limited on the boat, that's very in your face. You can't miss that everything's has to be contained on board. And we try to take the message that kids can think about their house as their microcosm, or their school as the microcosm, or your community as your microcosm, that you can really make a difference in your little space. If it feels overwhelming, that you may not be able to change the world in such ways that Lester Brown has found to be able to be working in policies and international issues, you can make a difference in your own space. And we try to have our programs be life-changing if you're open to it. We have had, in addition to the Meerwald, our facility in Bivalve is our campus, our focus, and we've had used it as a platform for a number of things. This is the 25th anniversary of the Western Hemispheric Shorebird Reserve with about 37 countries represented. We also were very honored that the local Lenape tribe chose our site to reenact the 300th anniversary and to reaffirm the peace treaty with the Swedes. That was, and it was wonderful to be part of that at our facility. We have an art gallery, we have a cafe, and we have an education venue to get people thinking about their place and their place in that place. Since we work in bivalve, and I don't know if you can tell from the photograph, this is after a full moon high tide. The building was built in 1904, and since then, the sea level has risen about a foot, which means that on a full moon high tide, and many times a year, we're out there with a pressure washer getting the mud off the docks. And so it's impossible to work out of a place like bivalve and not be very aware of the things that are changing in our world. I happen to also live in Money Island. This is an aerial shot taken by kite. And it's another place where it's hard to ignore the changing environment. And this is a typical bayshore scene where we have sandy white beaches and lots of marshland. And that's the road on a high tide. And so, you know, there was a time when I was kind of working with blinders a little bit, and before I married and had a child, I really thought that my solution to the rising sea levels might be something like this. You know, no problem getting to and from if you can have a car that's a boat. But in seriousness, you know, this is an issue that I hate to say that Sandy had positive effects, but in many ways it felt like it really helped the general population kind of focus a little bit more on sea level rise and the fact that we do have issues with storms that are coming. I think it helped people to, you know, when it hit New York City, all of a sudden it wasn't somebody else's problem. And I think it's here on the Bayshore in this area, I think it's made it harder to ignore. For the folks that live in the Bayshore, we actually held a Rising Tides Forum a week before Sandy hit, and we had a huge turnout. I think it's been obvious to people in the area that we do have, you know, whether you go into the politics of it or whose fault, you certainly can't argue with the fact that the climate's changing and the sea level's rising. So on an annual basis, we have a forum to kind of check in on how we're doing on those issues and trying to get the community engaged in conversations and working together on solutions. Some of the folks who attended, you know, this is a regular occurrence for business owners in the area. The farms, Shepherd Farm are a good example. We had a tour a couple weeks ago. This is one of the largest, you know, vegetable producing farms in the state, and the entire farm is diked, 14 miles of dikes. They are the largest asparagus growers in the state, and it's an amazing place with a lot of history and multiple generations of farmers, and they've taken it upon themselves to have the area diked and to be protected from, you know, the water in that way. And I think people have on their own basis kind of found ways to deal with things. And I mentioned that Sandy was a kind of a paradigm shifter for a lot of folks, that, you know, there are some areas literally right on the bay that have been thinking about this for years, but we really have to think about it a little bit further away. Here's a hurricane scenario map of the region and a sea level rise is the next map of the region. So there, you know, it's not just the very bayshore communities that have to be thinking about these things. The devastation, you know, in Cumberland County was horrific and not so much recognized as some other areas, but you can see there certainly was, you know, a bayshore impact from Sandy. And there's a dialogue that's to be had about where does it make sense to reinvest and where do we need to kind of think about retreating. I know that's not a popular concept, but unfortunately for the folks who have a personal and lifelong connection to Bay Point, that's one of the areas that we'll be retreating from. When you think about the 40 miles of coastline in the Bayshore and only 4 miles are inhabited, it makes you think that maybe it's worth trying to do something like what they have done for the farming with the dikes, or, you know, maybe saying for some communities on that small amount where we have that cultural relationship with the waterfront to try to make that investment. I felt that there was an important need to get the dialogue going more, and that you may have heard about my swim across the bay, just trying to bring people's attention to these issues, not to say that there are ready answers for it all, but that we need to have a dialogue. And that's what the recovery plan for the Bayshore has been about, trying to get the communities engaged in a dialogue about the future. And FEMA helped to pull us together. And I think that's the one thing that, to me, has been a positive outcome of the storm, is that folks are, there's a little bit more attention, even from a federal level, bringing people together and helping them grapple with these issues. It's not an easy answer. There's no you know, cookie cutter answer for how to respond to these issues. The Rising Tides Forum, and we have one coming up on November 18th, it's using the term forum loosely, not that there's an event, though there is one annually. There's also activities throughout the year trying to gather information, present, and have folks working together on shared solutions. And these are some of the key actions that the Rising Tides and the implementation team for the Bayshore Recovery Plan are working on. There's a regular water, I mean, there's some elements of the plan, with shoreline protection being one. And I think the importance of the economy is something that's really, it's been mentioned a number of times here tonight, or this morning, afternoon. But you can't really move forward and think about things when the economy isn't comfortable for people. You know, that you can't, people don't have the spare time to think about things when they're worrying about putting food on the table. And so the economy of the whole region really does become an environmental issue. And you know, our organization and the folks that are working on the Bayshore Recovery Plan have put that at not necessarily the top of the list, but right there, you know, in the high priorities that are really important to make sure that folks can make a living in the area. And we're working on an economic summit with a whole coalition of people trying to look at ways to have a sustainable economy on the Bayshore, building on the natural resources, building on the history of the area, building on its culture, but recognizing that people, you know, it's important to have a way to make a living. And I think there's some questions that I hope we're going to be focusing on that are kind of implicit in all that we've been talking about today. And I think, you know, Margaret Mead's quote is always relevant. And I think one question that I would kind of put out there is, what's our individual role in shaping our future? You know, it's one thing to talk about things globally, but each person really does have an impact. And two, how can we work together to have the most sustainable future? Because as Margaret Mead said, you know, it's not like a one-to-one correspondence. It's not that, you know, Jean does a few things and I do a few things and they add up to 6 things. They can add up to an exponential number of things if we're doing it together. And what can we do to stabilize the Bayshore and the county's economy in a sustainable way so that there's enough energy and interest to spare for those seemingly academic and long-range issues that are truly urgent, current, and personally relevant. And I hope we can grapple with that together. Thanks.
Thanks, Megan. Our final speaker for the panel this afternoon is John Norwood, who is Tribal Councilman and Principal Justice of the Tribal Supreme Court of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation. He also works with the National Congress of American Indians, as well as being a Christian minister and pastor.
I want to thank those who invited me to come speak, and also to indicate my sense of honor to be able to sit here with those who know so much about this particular topic, and to also honor my chief, Chief Gould, who has led our nation for most of the last 30 years. And we are grateful to him for his wisdom. When I was invited, one of the things that I asked was, why me? Because unlike those who are here with these credentials dealing with environmental sciences, I don't have that, at least not in environmental sciences, but I get the sense that move this down. I get the sense that one of the things that I was brought here to do was just simply to talk about the values that have been passed down among my people from ancient times. The relationship that we have to the land, which seems to be what is the aim and the model that I've heard reiterated by this panel, and that is to consider the impact that we're having in a fashion that we do not deplete resources, but we're able to continue to utilize the land, the resources in a way that sustains us into the future. My people believed that the land was living, and that's a value that's been passed down to the current generation. The land was never seen as something that was just to be possessed. It was never seen as just a resource to be used. Our ancestors taught us the value that the Creator placed us here to live in harmony with the land, to care for the land, and as we did, the land would care for us. Native Americans across North America refer to North America as Turtle Island. And it's not merely because there are a lot of turtles here, but because the actual landmass for many of the tribal people across North America was viewed to be on the back of a living turtle. And that even the tides were reflective of the respiration of the turtle moving up and down, floating on the water, sustaining the earth that we stand upon. The rivers, streams, creeks, bays, woods, all living, all having importance and relationship. When we would take the bark from a tree in order to use it to put side walls on our wigwams and longhouses, we didn't chop down the whole tree. It's still taught today that we would take an offering of tobacco, thank the Creator for the tree, ask permission to utilize the bark, remove the bark from the living tree, but not too much to do damage to the tree so that the tree might grow more bark and continue to live on, perhaps long after the person who borrowed the bark would be living. And this is the way that we continue to teach our children today. We have a summer program where these old traditions are being brought from the elders of the tribe down to the young people of the tribe, and our prayer is that these values will continue. And that even more so, that them sharing their cultural stories will cross-pollinate those from other cultures that have come to live on our land here in the land of the Lenape, which we call Lenape Hoking. It's important to understand also that as we talk about planning to preserve the environment, we're very mindful of how the best intentions often wind up having negative impacts for two reasons. One is that it's important to listen to the land, to understand that the earth does communicate with us. It tells us what's going on. One of my fellow panelists was talking about the impact on clams, the clamming production. Our people knew that there was a problem with clams a long time ago because the shells were used to make sacred items. We call wampum. And the difference in size over the past, I'd say, 50 years, and the difference in the coloration of the shell was an indication that something was happening that was wrong. And a lot of that was over farming and toxins that were in the water. The rivers, it's a shock. My chief talks about being able to go out and fish and eat whatever you get, and now you have to be very careful about the toxins that are in the water. And there are warning signs every now and then that some toxin is too high for you to be able to fish in the way that our people have done for generations in order to sustain themselves. In making plans to impact that, to change that, to reverse those kinds of things, one thing that is often left out is the voice of indigenous people. When there is an effort to preserve one type of a species, of a fish or an eel, oftentimes the one thing that is left out is consulting the people that have lived in harmony and relationship with those creatures for thousands of years. And new policies are imposed that wind up undermining that relationship and the inherent rights of the indigenous people. I give an example of some of our friends up in Alaska who were pulled from being able to fish. They fished to sustain themselves. And there were new regulations imposed without consultation with their community, regulations imposed by the state and federal government to preserve a certain type of fish that was of high interest for sports fishermen. And yet this was the type of fish that sustained the community. There were groups last year that were pulled and arrested because they wanted to feed their communities. Well, they weren't the ones that were committing the overfishing. They had lived there for thousands of years in harmony with the fish populations. And yet they were being cut off because of environmental policies that did not take into consideration the indigenous ways of life in that region that weren't the problem to begin with. So while I absolutely agree that it's important to execute these plans, and certainly I would not claim to be wise enough to understand all of the implications, what I can say is we have to be careful how we implement. And that it's important to listen to the earth and important to listen to the indigenous people of those regions that have been living in communion and harmony with the earth for generations. Because what they know will guide us into the future. The lessons that our elders have passed down for generations will teach us how to restore the earth that the Creator gave us. And that's about all I have to say right now.
Thank you, John. At this point, we can open up for some questions. We really only have a short period of time for questions, so I'll ask you, if you do get to ask a question, please be very focused and direct with your question. You may direct it towards Lester, or to Mike Edelstein, or to anyone on our panel, or maybe just in general to the stage. And as well, panelists, I'll ask you to keep your answers fairly brief so we can have at least a few questions. Thanks. Cindy has her hand up first, I think.
I don't know who to address this to, but thank you, Mr. Brown, very much for your speech. As you were talking, I was trying to think what of what you said could be brought back to Bridgeton. And one of the key elements that really struck me was water depletion. Because right now there's a plan by the Utilities Authority to run sewer to Down and to Greenwich, which is a wonderful idea, except the water will be drawn up, brought here, processed, and dumped into the river, which does nothing for recharge, nothing for our aquifer. How, I guess this is directed to Mr. Brown, how do you affect a policy at the governmental level that would use the water that's treated and apply it back to agriculture, fields, or in some way recharge the aquifer?
I wish I could say thank you for that question. It's a tough one. What we have done in creating cities generally, I mean, we're talking about Greenwich, which is a very small community, but we have disrupted the nutrient cycle. When we were essentially a rural community, waste went back on the land, whether from the dairy barn or the chicken house or from in the form of human waste. It just went back on the land. It was automatic. Now we have a situation where we've in creating cities and even smaller communities where we've disrupted the nutrient cycle and have not done a good job of getting the nutrients back on the land. I mean, just to give an example of the size of this drain, one of our big markets for grain is Japan. And so we have nutrients from Kansas and Iowa ending up in Japan, and in many cases in Tokyo Bay. Japan happens to be a large island country, so a lot of waste just goes offshore. But these are the kinds of issues that we have not done a good job in dealing with, because we've lost sight of the fact that a balanced system is one that recycles continuously and all the time. So I don't have an answer to the situation in Greenwich, but I think the idea of discharging human waste into the bay or the river, as the case may be, is not the way to go.
If I can comment as well, I think there are a couple issues there. One of the other issues besides the loss of nutrients has to do with what in most places would be interbasin water transfer, but here is basically taking water and releasing it through the sewer treatment plant in a way that it's not coming back to recharge the groundwater. You're basically having a loss of water. And we have, in many of our sewer basins in the United States, certainly where I live in upstate New York, the main water that, or much of the water that goes into the northern New Jersey water system comes through the Ramapo River, and it's water from my county in New York that's sent through our sewer treatment plant and ends up as drinking water in northern New Jersey. And that interbasin transfer, of course, robs our region of much of its water. So this comes back to something that actually Lester referred to in terms of really thinking comprehensively about what we're doing, because we are moving resources, whether they're nutrients or whether they're water, without really talking about how we balance our needs within a given region. And that's a significant problem. The other thing I was going to say is that to the extent that federal funds are used, there should be a review under the National Environmental Policy Act. And although these issues are not ones that are necessarily invited in that process because they're fundamental questions, it's important to bring them through that process because we have the opportunity to debate the adverse potential impacts, the long-term impacts, and to study them and to have decision makers informed about the consequences before those decisions are made. Once we're doing it, it's hard to come back and revisit it, but it's not impossible to do that. And so NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, is another context to really think about. In New Jersey, because you don't have a state version of NEPA, I'm not sure that there's as much consciousness about impact assessment as there are in states that do have state versions. But this is an amazing tool if it's used properly, and it's something to pay attention to.
Any quick comments from the panel on this?
Well, I would just comment that the Land Use Sewage Authority, they use a lot of their treated effluent. It's treated, and they use that on crops that are sold not for human consumption. They also spray irrigate into ponds so that to help facilitate groundwater recharge. So those technologies are out there. They're not widely used. We tend to treat the water and put it back into the rivers. I mean, at least in this scenario, you're talking about treating it, well, if it's water, if it's treatment coming from Greenwich, it's staying within the watershed, it's going back into the rivers. I mean, understand it's to a very high water quality standard that they're treating it. And then second, these communities that are being hooked up, if you're talking about the villages like Greenwich and the Bayshore communities, the numbers, I mean, we probably don't even have over 1,000 residents in Greenwich. I'm not sure how big, 800, the impact would be that big. Where it concerns me is in places like Cape May County where you have, you know, tens of thousands of residents and they're treating that limited freshwater resource in an area where sea level rise is a huge issue, where aquifers, shallow ground aquifers are being dewatered, affecting priceless freshwater wetlands protected by the federal government. You know, it's just they're flushing it out into the ocean, and that's where they should look at, you know, groundwater recharge, you know, where you're talking about huge populations affecting resources where we can actually measure that the groundwater table is affecting surface water resources.
I think one of the issues in Greenwich is the fact that within the historic village, the traditional lot size is so small that the physical capacity of the lot to maintain an on-site sewage disposal system is very limited. And you compound that with the fact that it's also on-site water. Yes, there's a complete cycle there that from an environmental standpoint is quite nice, but there is the issue of contamination. And with rising sea level, we are anticipating rising groundwater level as well. And so there's no easy solution. One solution that would complete the cycle would be to return the water to the ground using a local package treatment plant and deal with it right there in Greenwich rather than bringing it back into Bridgeton.
Certainly our options and a lot of these technologies are known. Megan, quickly, please.
Yeah, so there's some discussion at some point at the county level, but I think what's happening right now, the 4 communities involved in the recovery plan have each applied for grants to do a feasibility study that would keep things local, like Michael suggested, that looking at batch plants and you know, so that there might be a smaller solution rather than having the county send to all of the other places, but have each of the places have the best solution for their community right there in the community, so you don't have the out-of-basin transfers happening, and you know, keep it on a scale that's appropriate for the communities that have the need.
Just to add one other note, when you release sewage water, even though under the Clean Water Act we are looking at what the effluents are, there are many components of water at this point that are not covered by the way that we do that. For example, pharmaceuticals and all the medicines that we take, which we're releasing into whatever receiving ecosystems and having adverse impacts. There's a real interesting direction that all this is going if you pay attention to what are called living machines, or the ability to actually take waste and treat it in either a wetland system externally or to create artificial wetlands even inside buildings. And you can begin to think about buildings as having a potential zero waste profile, the same way we can talk about them having a zero energy profile. And I think that's very promising, particularly if you look at the community level. And there certainly are models of that work. And so it's another alternative.
All right, another question, please. Actually, in the back, Maggie. I'm sorry. Oh, we have someone.
I'd like to ask a question of the panel. First of all, how do you factor in the abundance of animal waste coupled with the human waste into this paradigm? And for Reverend Norwood, I'd like to ask, what do you propose to be done to strike a more equitable balance between commercial interests and the interests of the indigenous populations of some of these communities that are being affected?
Well, I'll let one of my colleagues answer the first part of the question, because I don't know what to do with animal waste, but I will answer your question when they finish.
Why don't you go ahead right now and get that second part?
In regard to balancing the interest, the first and largest issue is communication. What many Americans don't understand is that Native populations often are not consulted. Or when we're consulted, it's after the solution's already been decided on. We're simply told what's going to happen. Our wisdom is not valued in far too many ways. And it would be, in order to strike that balance, the first thing that has to happen is communication and negotiation, and an acknowledgement of the rights of the indigenous populations that have lived on the land. You will most likely find great progress if there is that level of communication. It would be wonderful if, when government agencies are making decisions, instead of just simply inviting the Native population to come and listen to the grand plan, that they would come and listen to the Native population and seriously take that into consideration.
Great. Anybody on animal waste want to weigh in?
I would just note the parallels between the problems with animal waste and human waste. With human waste, the problems really began to emerge when we created the first cities, and we concentrate a lot of waste in one place. The same is true for animals. It's not cities, it's feedlots, where you get huge numbers of cattle in a very small area, for example, and bringing a lot of feed in, and you get a lot of manure. And it has led to some discussions of limiting the size of these types of operations, and in some states they may have done that, but from a purely economic point of view, maybe the bigger the better, but from a waste management point of view, maybe we should be limiting the size of the huge poultry operations or the size of feedlots, so we don't get these potentially unmanageable concentrations of nutrients in a very small area.
It's not a huge problem in the Cohansey watershed in that we don't have a lot of land that's dedicated to pasture land or these sort of industrial sized uses like you've pictured and read about happening in the southeast with the big chicken farms and whatnot. I mean, what we do know is, looking at the science, is that there is a fecal coliform issue. It seems like it may be coming more from wildlife than domestic farm animals. And why is it such a problem? I mean, it's not like we have necessarily more wildlife than other places, although we have an abundance of natural resources. I sometimes wonder if it may be partly the effect that a lot of the forest cover has been removed and purposed to agriculture in the Cohansey watershed. And so perhaps there's less area available for animals, and so they tend to sort of concentrate, in the riparian areas which are still forested, which border and buffer the river. So, things like vegetative swales and reforestation projects, I think that might be the answer, but, a lot of that good work is actually being addressed right now by the Cohansey Area River Preservation Group, the County Health Department and the State DEP. So, there is an issue, it's being addressed.
I was just going to comment that on the East Coast, if you go down to the Chesapeake, you have a really serious problem with pig farms, which have caused extraordinary degradation of water systems and created major health problems. And what Lester said about scale is extremely important. Also, that animal waste can be handled the way human waste can. To some extent, they have more freedom in that you can just compost it, you can make biofuels out of it. You have to realize that the materials cycle. There is no such thing as waste, and so what we call waste can be treated as a resource. We have to figure out what that resource use is. It's harder and harder to use it as a resource the more we contaminate it, and the question is, how do we actually clean up our waste streams so that they in fact can be used as a resource? That's true of animal feed as it is with human waste and with all other waste streams.